The bear trap is an obscure urban legend about a soldier who lost his teeth and had them replaced with a steel trap. The legend of the bear trap begins during the Vietnam War. There was a general who was stern and harsh. All of the men serving under him feared him. One day, his squad was ambushed and pinned down under enemy fire. A shell landed near him and exploded. He was hit by flying shrapnel, injuring his face and shattering all of his teeth. His squad was isolated in the jungle and cut off from reinforcements. The South Vietnamese medic had to perform emergency surgery on the general, but without the proper tools and facilities, he had to use whatever he found nearby. The surgery was rough and primitive, but it saved the general's life. However, it permanently disfigured his face. The surgeon replaced his teeth with a steel bear trap that he found amongst the trees. Once his wounds had healed, the general's face was a horrible sight and the gnashing metal teeth were terrifying. When the general was able to return to headquarters, he refused further medical treatment and made sure no word got to his superiors about his injury. His troops, fearing his wrath and understanding that the military was his life, covered up the incident, allowing him to remain at his post. The poor quality of the surgery caused an infection in his mouth, which escalated into a fever. He became crazed and delusional. The South Vietnamese surgeon tended to him during this time, until he was well. Afterwards, they say, he was never quite right in the head and became increasingly cruel and violent. The soldiers nicknamed him Old Bear Trap. When captured North Vietnamese soldiers were being interrogated, the general would often use his bear trap teeth to threaten them. On some occasions, he would even bite them, tearing off chunks of their flesh and maiming them. At night, some prisoners went missing from their cells. In the morning, all that was left of them was a pool of blood on the cell floor. Initially, the guards thought the prisoners had escaped, but witnesses later spotted the general carrying piles of gnawed human bones into the jungle. Because of his suspicious and violent behavior, he rapidly lost the respect of his troops. As time went on, they became more and more afraid of their commanding officer, suspecting that he was murdering and eating captured enemy soldiers. Something had to be done. Before the end of the war, his troops begged a lieutenant in the army to take action against the crazed general. The lieutenant filed an official complaint, accusing the general of war crimes. The general was tried in a military courtroom and found guilty of murder and cannibalism. The court sentenced him to life in prison, but before he could serve one day in jail, he mysteriously escaped and fled into the jungle. The military spent years trying to track him down, but they could find no trace of him. It was as if the jungles of Vietnam had swallowed him up. He was eventually forgotten, and the military listed him as missing in action. Several years later, the lieutenant who had filed the complaint against the general retired from the army. He returned to the USA, but a few days after his arrival, he was found dead under suspicious circumstances. Emergency services got a call telling them that there had been a car accident. When they arrived, they found the lieutenant dead at the scene. The car's 4 tires were found to have puncture marks in them. The windshield of the car was completely shattered and a bear trap was clamped tightly around the lieutenant's face. Police were baffled. They couldn't figure out how the accident had happened. The only theory they could come up with was that a bear trap had fallen off a hunter's vehicle and lay in the middle of the road. When the lieutenant drove by, the bear trap must have somehow punctured all 4 tires and then flicked up onto the front of the car, smashing the windshield and clamping around the man's head, causing the crash. It seemed bizarre, but there was no other civil explanation, or was there? Police said that the man who called the emergency services to report the crash had sounded quite elderly, and had spoken with a pronounced lisp, as if he had recently lost his teeth. The Hot Air Balloon is a scary story about a boy who won a prize in a competition of a ride in a hot air balloon. A young boy was reading his town's local newspaper when he came across an announcement for a competition. They were giving away a number of prizes. First prize was a hot air balloon ride, second prize was a bungee jump, and third prize was an electric toaster. The boy had always wanted to fly in a hot air balloon. He dreamed of climbing up into the clear blue sky, soaring high above the clouds and following the breeze wherever it took him. Filled with excitement, he cut the entry form out of the newspaper, quickly filled it in and sent it off in the mail. A few weeks later, when the winners were announced, the boy couldn't believe his luck. He had won first prize: the hot air balloon ride. It was like a dream come true. He could hardly wait. The morning that the flight was to take place finally arrived, and his parents dropped him off at a large field on the outskirts of town. It was filled with hot air balloons, and people were walking around, making last-minute adjustments and getting ready to take off. An instructor in a blue jumpsuit was there to greet him. He led the boy over to one of the hot air balloons and told him to hop in. Just as they were preparing to take off, the instructor got a call on his mobile phone. "Hold on, I've got to take this," he said to the boy. "It could be important. I'll be back in a few minutes. Don't go anywhere." With that, the instructor jumped out of the hot air balloon and walked briskly over to the side of the field where the cars and vans were parked. The boy stood waiting in the basket for a long time, watching the other hot air balloons take off and climb into the sky. He began to wonder what was taking the instructor so long. Just then, a man who was dressed in a blue suit approached him and asked, "Are you ready to take off?" "I don't know," replied the boy. "I'm waiting for the instructor. He said he'd be back soon." "Oh, he's gone," said the man. "His wife was in an accident or something. He sent me to replace him." "So are you ready to take off?" I guess so," said the boy, stepping back. The man climbed into the basket and began loosening the ropes. After struggling impatiently with the knots for a minute or two, he muttered, "We don't have time for this. We're already behind schedule." He took a small knife out of his pocket and quickly sliced through the ropes. The balloon suddenly took off and the boy was nearly knocked off his feet as it swiftly ascended into the air. "That's more like it," laughed the man. "Up we go." A few seconds later, the basket stopped jerking around and righted itself, soaring smoothly into the sky. The boy listened with great interest as the instructor pointed out all of the controls to him. "This here is the gigawatt multiplier and it connects to the manifold distributor," he said with an air of authority. "If you want to go up, you just pump the flux capacitor here, and if you want to go left and right, you tug on the umbilical cords over there." As they passed over the town, the instructor began to grow a little uneasy. "Do you think they can see us from down there?" he inquired anxiously. The boy looked over the side. "Yes, I'm sure they can," he replied. The man shook his head. "No, I mean, can they see our faces? Can they recognize us?" "Of course not," said the boy, suspecting it was a trick question. "We're too high up." "Not high enough," said the man. He seemed to be very agitated and kept repeating, "I hope they don't see me, I hope they don't see me." The boy wondered what was wrong with him. A minute later, the man picked up one of the sandbags. "This is ballast," he explained. "It's what's keeping us down. We want to go up, up, up." He dropped the sandbag he was holding over the side and then began throwing out the other sandbags, left and right. The balloon began to rise slowly. Up, 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 it soared into the clouds. Then the man pulled off his coat and tossed it overboard. That lightened her, he shouted triumphantly, "but it's still not enough. We need to go higher, higher, higher." He began loosening his tie. The boy was shocked and didn't know what to think. "Nobody can recognize you at this distance, even if they had a telescope," he said. "Don't be too sure of that," replied the man. "They have sharp eyes at the home." "At where?" asked the boy. "At the mental home," the man shouted. At that moment, the boy's heart skipped a beat. A chill went down his spine as the horrible truth dawned on him. He was all alone in a hot air balloon with an escaped mental patient. For a few seconds, the boy struggled to make sense of the situation. The maniac kept repeating his insane cries of "higher, higher, higher, as he took off his clothes and threw them out into the wind. When he finally tossed his socks over the side, the man stood there stark naked and said, "We're not high enough yet. We need to be about 10,000 miles higher." The escaped lunatic picked up the last sandbag and heaved it over the side. The balloon rose slightly, but the maniac still wasn't satisfied and again began to mutter to himself, deep in thought. The boy was eyeing him nervously and had broken out into a cold sweat. He was desperately wishing that this was all a nightmare, and that he would wake up and find himself safe and sound in his own bed. "I know," the man suddenly cried. "There's nothing else for it. One of us will just have to throw the other one out." The boy couldn't believe what was happening. When he saw the sparkle in the madman's eyes, it chilled him to the bone. "Have you got a wife and children?" the man asked, abruptly. Thinking quickly, the boy said that he was married and had 14 young kids who depended on him for everything. "Ha ha 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 ha," laughed the maniac. "I have 300 wives and 5,000 children," he declared, proudly. "And I have to get home to them in time to cook their dinner." The terrified boy decided that the only way out of this situation was to humor the crazed man. Playing for time, he asked, "And where do they live?" "On the moon," replied the maniac as he suddenly grabbed the young boy around the hips, lifted him up and tossed him over the side. The Gold Coins is a ghost story from Spain about a young girl who discovers some hidden treasure in the middle of the night. The story of the gold coins is an urban legend that can be heard all over the city of Córdoba in Spain. Over the years, it has passed from person to person by word of mouth. According to the legend, in the center of Córdoba, there is an old, dilapidated house that is said to be haunted. The house is very big and has many rooms. All of the floors are covered in black tiles. Many years ago, it was owned by one of the most important and wealthy families in the city. The family consisted of a man, his wife, and their 8-year-old daughter. They also had a team of servants and maids who lived with them. One night, when the little girl was lying in bed, unable to sleep, she heard some noises in the corridor outside her room. Being a very curious child, she slowly opened the door of her bedroom and looked out into the long, dark corridor. At the end of the hallway, she could make out a small figure, crouching down. As her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she was surprised to see a young boy, the same age as herself. He was carrying a lighted candle in his hand and he was lifting one of the small stone slabs on the tiled floor. She watched as the young boy took something from his pocket and placed it beneath the tile. After he replaced the tile, the boy suddenly vanished into thin air. The little girl couldn't believe what she was seeing. She looked back down the corridor and noticed that one of the maids had been peeking out of her own bedroom door and had witnessed the same strange scene. The maid grabbed a candle and came hurrying over to the little girl. They both knew what they had seen. The young boy was a ghost. Together, they cautiously approached the place where the boy had been crouching. They lifted the tile and discovered that there was a large hole underneath it. Peering down into the hole, by the dim light of the candle, they noticed something glittering. The maid held up the slab as she lowered the little girl into the hole. The child could not believe what she found. It was a pile of gold coins. Shaking with excitement, she gathered up the coins and handed them out to the maid. Then, the maid grabbed her by the hand and pulled her out of the hole. They replaced the tile and it fit back perfectly, looking like it had never been moved. The maid could hardly believe her luck and the child could barely contain her excitement. Both of them decided that they should keep the discovery of the gold coins a secret. The maid warned the little girl not to mention anything about their find to her parents or the other servants. The next night, at the same time, the girl and the maid were peeking out their bedroom doors, eagerly waiting for the ghostly little boy to appear. They watched as the spectral figure made its way down the corridor, lifted a tile and placed some gold coins into the hole beneath. After he disappeared, the maid lowered the girl into the hole under the slab so that she could retrieve the gold coins. Night after night, they repeated the same process. It seemed as if the treasure would never end. Each time, by the light of a candle, the girl got down into the small, narrow hole under the tile and gave the coins to the maid, who put them inside a big sack. One night, the candle was almost finished, and as the maid lowered the girl into the hole, the light started to flicker. The maid told to the little girl to hurry up. She had to get out of the hole before the candle went out, because they already had enough money. She pulled the little girl out of the hole, but at last moment one of the coins fell from the child's hands. Without thinking, the little girl jumped back into the hole again. The maid tried to catch her, but in doing so, she let go of the tile and it slammed down, covering the hole. Suddenly, the candle went out. The maid began to panic. In the darkness, she tried to make her way down the corridor to her bedroom to fetch another candle. It was pitch black and she couldn't see a thing. She had to feel her way along the wall until she reached her bedroom door. Searching desperately in the dark, she couldn't find any candles. With a lot of difficulty, the maid felt her way down the darkened corridor until she came to the kitchen. She rummaged through the drawers and eventually came across another candle. She lit it and quickly returned to the corridor. To her horror, the maid realized that she couldn't remember which tile the little girl was under. In the dim light, she searched and searched, prying at each tile, but the corridor was so long and so wide and there were so many tiles that she was unable to find the right one. Finally, she gave up and, clutching her bag of gold coins, she went back to bed. In the morning, the little girl's parents woke up to find that their daughter had disappeared. They questioned the servants, but each one said they had no idea where the little girl could be. A complete search of the entire house was organized, but it turned up nothing. The distraught parents were baffled by their daughter's mysterious disappearance. The maid decided not to say anything about what happened that night. A few days later, the mother was crying in her bedroom when she heard a voice calling out. She recognized the voice immediately. It was the voice of her daughter. The little girl was crying out for someone to help her. "Please, help me. Let me out of here, please." The mother searched the house again. Sometimes the screams seemed to be coming from one part of the house, but when she got there, the screams sounded like they were coming from somewhere else. Try as they might, the parents could not pinpoint the source of the screams. The father dug up floors, demolished walls, and punched holes in ceilings, all in an effort to figure out where the girl's cries for help were coming from. After almost destroying the interior of the house, the parents were forced to admit defeat. For months, they lived in the building, listening to the incessant cries of their beloved daughter, unable to do anything to find her. All of this took its toll on their mental and physical health. Eventually, the mother lost her mind and committed suicide. The father, devastated by grief, moved away and died of a heart attack a few years later. The people of Córdoba say that this is a true story and the house is still standing today. According to the legend, if you go there at night, they say you can still hear the screams of a little girl, pleading for help. The house has become famous all over Spain, and sometimes teenagers visit the place at night to test their courage and see if they can find any gold coins. Others go there to explore the huge building in an attempt to discover where the remains of the little girl are located. As yet, nobody has been brave enough to spend the night there. The house is now boarded up and the neighbors often call the police because of the strange cries and screams that come from within. They say that when the police arrive to investigate, the only thing that they find is an old candle, sitting on an old stone tile in the middle of the floor. When I was 8 years old, my parents sent me to stay with my grandmother for a few weeks. She lived in a small cottage on the outskirts of a little village. It was a boring little village and there were no other children my age. There was not very much I could do to keep myself amused. One day, I was wandering through the fields behind my grandmother's cottage when I came across an old abandoned well. It was on a hill that was overgrown with thistles and nettles. Someone had placed wooden boards over the top of the well and they were screwed into place. One of the boards was loose, so I pulled it off and peered down into the darkness. I wondered how deep it was, so I found a stone and dropped it into the well. After a long pause, I heard a distant plop. It seemed like fun, so I gathered up a bunch of stones and started dropping them in. One of the neighbors saw what I was doing and came rushing out of her house. She grabbed me by the arm and pulled me away from the well. Then, she started shouting at me and told me to stay away it. She didn't say why, but it scared me so much that I just ran off. That evening, I told my grandmother what had happened. She got angry and lashed out at me, giving me a clip around the ear. She told me to stay away from the well, but she didn't explain why. All she said was that it was a bad well. A couple of days later, I started having strange dreams. I dreamed that I was walking through a field, but it was covered in a thick mist. I was barefoot, and when I looked down at the ground, there was no grass, just black ashes. There was nobody around, and I was all alone. I kept walking, and out of the mist, I saw the old abandoned well emerge. I stopped at the well and peered over the edge. I couldn't see anything, but I could hear bubbling water. All of a sudden, a pair of gnarled hands appeared from the well. I recoiled in horror and turned to run away, but the hands stretched out of the well and followed me. Horrified, I tried to escape from those grasping hands with their long, horrible fingers, but as often happens in nightmares, it felt like I was running in place. The hands kept stretching more and more, and I felt the disgusting touch of those long fingers grabbing me by my bare ankles. Just then, I woke up in a cold sweat. Even after I was awake, I could still feel the sensation of those wretched hands gripping me by the ankles. Terrified and speechless, I just sat there for a few moments, trying to catch my breath. Outside, it was raining and I could hear the raindrops pounding against my window. When I looked up at the window, I was shocked by what I saw. On the wet glass were two long prints, as if made by a huge hand with enormous fingers. For the next few days, I was afraid to leave the house, but after a week had passed without any more bad dreams, I finally relaxed. I even worked up enough courage to go back to the old, abandoned well. I pulled off the board and looked down into it. Far below, in almost complete darkness, I could make out the black water at the bottom. All of a sudden, I saw something moving in the water. It was some sort of black shape. Terrified, I jumped back from the edge and ran all the way back to the cottage. When I got there, I told my grandmother what I had seen. She flew into a panic and hurried from house to house, telling all of the neighbors. By nightfall, the whole village was in a panic. Everyone blamed me for playing around at the well, but nobody told me why. Every house had a crucifix hanging above the front door. The neighbors shut themselves in their houses. They locked their doors, closed the shutters on their windows, and kept their lights on all night. My grandmother placed a crucifix above her door too, and we spent the night sleeping on the kitchen floor, with the front door locked, the windows shuttered, and all the lights on. The next morning, my parents arrived to collect me. My grandmother took them into the kitchen to talk to them, and I was told to wait in the car. They were in there a long time, and when they came out, their faces were grim. Without a word, they got into the car and we drove back to the city. It wasn't until years later that I learned what my grandmother had told them. She said that, many years ago, there had been a woman who lived in the village. Her cottage had been on the other side of the hill. She was extremely jealous, and she was convinced that her husband had been cheating on her. One day, while he was at work, she decided to take her revenge. She took their children and, one by one, she marched them up to the well and chopped off their heads with an axe. Then, she tossed their remains down into the well. She waited until her husband arrived home from work, and when his back was turned, she attacked him with the axe. After she had chopped him into little pieces, she set the house on fire. Then, she went back up to the well and jumped in, drowning herself. For years afterwards, people would disappear from the village and no one ever knew what had happened to them. My own grandfather had disappeared one night when he was out for a walk, and he was never seen again. Villagers believed it had something to do with the well, so they boarded it up and stayed away from it. Sometimes, I still dream about those horrible stretching hands. At night, I'm still afraid to leave my feet out from under the blanket in case I feel those cold fingers around my ankles. And whenever it rains, I still look at the window and expect to see, outlined by the drops of water on the window, the prints of those huge hands.